Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about health inequalities in the early years. When I spoke to David Walsh about this talk, he said, don't just describe the problem, think about what the solutions might be. So I'm going to start with a very brief intro to health inequalities in the early years in Scotland, and then think about some of the things that we could be doing to help shape policy and practice, focusing on a couple of strands of work that we're carrying out. The first is thinking of how we can better understand health inequalities using linked data, and then thinking about options for reducing health inequalities. I know we have a whole session on this in the second half of today, but I thought it would be nice to do that in the context of the early years. So I hope everybody's already sold on this, but why should we care about health inequalities in the early years? They're preventable. They're particularly unfair for children who have very little control over their environments and their health behaviours. They emerge early, track across the life course, and the early years are thought to be, for that reason, an effective time to intervene. They're pervasive, so we see them for almost every aspect of child health in Scotland and elsewhere. And here we have seen that they're persisting and in some cases getting worse. So there's a couple of examples of that in these two graphs here. So on the left-hand side, trends in the prevalence of children identified as having developmental concerns in toddlerhood. And we're seeing that there's been improvements over time. Concerns are declining, but we've got really big inequalities still between the most deprived areas in the top dark blue line at the top compared to the least deprived areas in the bottom. And then on the right-hand side, an example of how things are getting worse. Childhood obesity at the start of school, we're seeing inequalities widen. This is up until the pandemic, and we know things changed dramatically since then, but safe to say inequalities persisted. Okay, so how can we use linked data to understand inequalities better? Over the past few years, we've been creating what we're calling an administrative cohort. So we've taken all children born in Scotland in 2010 to 2012 and linked various health records. So they're shown down the left-hand side of the chart. So prescribing data, hospital records, child health checks, and so forth. And through linking those and following the children, at the moment we're up until age 6, we can start to track their health longitudinally. So in the green arrows, for example, we've got the mum's mental illness measured crudely through prescribing for anxiety and depression, ADHD prescriptions in the child. The purple bars are showing different health outcomes and developmental outcomes we have through child health checks and so forth. In the sort of middle bar below that, we've got different socio-economic measures, SECs. I'll probably use that a few times. So we've got the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, our sort of most commonly and easily used measure. But then through linking to birth records, we can also get at the occupational status of parents and also their relationship status as well. So we can measure things like lone parenthood. And then we've got various other socio-demographics. So I'm briefly going to talk through some of the things that we've been doing with this data. It's a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour and only gives you a very sort of snapshot view of what can be done. So firstly, we can look at timing and chronicity because we're following children up over time now. So here is an example of maternal mental illness. So we've tracked that from pre-pregnancy through to the child being age 6. And this bar chart is showing the prevalence of the sort of most common longitudinal patterns of prescribing for mental illness. So in the bottom pink bar, we've got 60% roundabout of mothers who were not prescribed over that period. In the two sort of mid-red bars, they're mothers who were being prescribed for sort of relatively short periods, whether it be earlier on in that period or childhood. Then in the top 3 darker red bars are those who are being prescribed over longer periods of time. So those from infancy onwards, those who were being prescribed before pregnancy and then picked medications up after pregnancy, or those right across the period. So then we can look at inequalities in those different longitudinal groupings. So this bar chart is showing us the social gradient in each of those groupings according to the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So we're seeing social gradients in all of those different patterns of prescribing, but they're particularly steep for the more chronic patterns of prescribing, so those from infancy onwards or across the period. As I said, through linking to birth records, we can look at this according to other socio-economic measures. So the blue bar charts are showing us that according to occupational status of the mother, and in the green we've got marital status, so comparing sole registrations down to married couples. And so we're seeing, again, really steep gradients, particularly in the most chronic outcomes, and also ever so slightly steeper when you look at family-level socioeconomic circumstances. Here's a second example, so patterns of infant feeding. So we've looked at that in hospital in the first fortnight, and then at 6 to 8 weeks. And these line graphs, so sorry, I'm showing you inequalities in a different way now, but we've got social gradients for the 3 different longitudinal patternings of infant feeding, with each of the coloured lines representing a different socioeconomic measure. So not much of a social gradient in the mothers that initiated breastfeeding. The same for those who were breastfeeding still at the first visit, but then we start to see a really big social gradient in those who were breastfeeding at 6 to 8 weeks. We've also created a sort of cumulative score of disadvantage, so that's now in that red line, and we see an even steeper social gradient. We can also start to look at possible causal chains. So we know there are inequalities in breastfeeding, inequalities in maternal mental illness, and you might think that maternal illness could sit on that causal pathway. So here we're looking at the association between mental illness before pregnancy and breastfeeding, and we're seeing really big associations when it comes to breastfeeding at 6 to 8 weeks. So little difference in those who are breastfeeding for shorter periods. Inequalities get bigger once we look at longer periods. So just to summarise briefly that bit, hopefully I've shown that we can deepen our understanding of child health inequalities using admin data in this way, showing that inequalities are potentially greater for persistent outcomes, that they vary for different aspects of socioeconomic circumstances and are potentially steeper when we start to look at family level aspects, particularly multiple disadvantages, and we can start to understand the associations between mothers and child health. Lots of benefits of linked admin data and lots of limitations as well. I won't go into those, but you can read more about this data set on the MatchNet website. I think the slides will be circulated so you can see that link. So on to the second part. So now this is thinking about mediation methods and how we can examine them to think about hypothetical, quite simplistic policy impacts. So in this work, we're essentially saying, okay, so in an ideal world, we would be intervening on socioeconomic circumstances in order to improve health and reduce health inequalities. We're chipping away at that in Scotland, but with that goal not achievable anytime soon, the idea is, well, let's look at the causal pathways. What are the mechanisms that might be amenable to change that could then block part of the effect that social disadvantage has on kids' health? So in this example, we're looking at parenting quality or parenting style as sitting on the causal pathway. And the potential for that pathway to reduce inequalities or block part of that effect depends on several different things. The dose or effectiveness of the interventions that we have available to us, who's eligible for those, and who takes those interventions up, and are there differences in the characteristics of those people. So can't answer that in trials. And so essentially what we're taking is cohort data and trial evidence, putting those together to ask some what-if questions. This slide summarises the methods. You can look to the paper if you're interested to see more, but I want to focus on this slide, which I think is the more interesting. So we spoke with parents and decision makers about hypothetical interventions that we could model. So there are 6 different scenarios here, and they vary according to eligibility and effectiveness. For uptake, we opted to just model 75% across the board. The effectiveness is drawn from trial evidence. So at the top, we've got a universal intervention where all parents are hypothetically receiving this intervention, which is seeing a 0.4 standard deviation change in their parenting style. In the second, the groups were interested to see if they were targeted at families on benefits. Because it's a targeted intervention, the dose is higher at 0.9 standard deviations. Proportionate universal intervention, combining those 2 things. And then there were a few targeted interventions at other groups that they were interested to see as well. So this graph is showing us the prevalence of childhood poor mental health across the x-axis. So around 11.5% of children had mental health problems. And on the y-axis, we're seeing relative inequalities between the highest and lowest income groups. So almost a 5-fold difference in relative terms. And then these different coloured dots are showing what happened when we simulated these different interventions. So the green dot at the top, number 1, that's the universal intervention, which did a pretty good job of reducing prevalence at the population level, sort of down by 2% in absolute terms, but didn't alter inequalities, if anything, increased them slightly. In the grey scenario at the bottom, number 2, targeted intervention, reduced inequalities by a little bit, doesn't do much to population prevalence. And then in the others, we're seeing that there's not a huge amount of movement, particularly when we're thinking from an inequalities perspective. So we've been carrying out various simulations like this. This is work I'm doing with colleagues at the UCL Institute of Child Health as well. And we've found in other simulations that interventions to increase physical activity are not going to reduce inequalities in childhood overweight, no matter the dose. Universal childcare provision to under 2s could potentially increase inequalities in child's social emotional development if we don't pay careful attention to the quality. And we found that you can simulate more radical scenarios. One of those has been levelling up. So levelling up the mediator between the richer and poorer groups. That tends to have a rather big impact on inequalities, but in reality, we can't achieve those levelling up scenarios via existing interventions that are targeting people's behaviours, and so it just points to the need to change the fundamental causes of inequalities. So in summary, through examining these mediating pathways, they're simplistic, but policymakers have really liked hearing about the different pathways and the fact that they can show which pathways might hold more or less potential for reducing inequalities, the scale of change that could be required, and the impacts of different eligibility criteria and the need to take into account uptake. There are all sorts of assumptions that come along with this method, as any method in observational data. And we're also limited to the pathways that we could look at. In terms of our mediators, we often got dragged downstream because what was measured. So we looked at parenting, health behaviours. Childcare was as upstream as we managed to get. We can't control for the existing policy context, so the Millennium Cohort kids growing up at the turn of the century under Labour, very different situation, all sorts of policies, interventions going on. There are more sophisticated approaches, and we're going to be seeing some of those later on this morning. So just to briefly look ahead, there's, I believe, still lots of untapped potential when it comes to our use of administrative data. So there's far more analysis that can be done with this cohort that we've already created. There's also lots of potential to follow those children across childhood and into adolescence. Potential to link to other sectors, and so we're going to be hearing from Denise in a bit about social care and health linkages. And we can also look to other family members as well, so start to understand what's going on with siblings, grandmothers. Fathers aren't on there because unfortunately I think that's probably out of our grasp for the foreseeable future. We can link mothers and children via hospital records, maternity records. It's going to be far harder to get hold of dads. And I think what these simulations sort of in their entirety have indicated to me, but also nested within a huge evidence base and theories around what we need to do to reduce health inequalities, is to maintain focus upstream. As I mentioned before, trials in that area are really problematic. They're difficult to do, and so simulations and natural policy experiments are the sort of main tools in our kit, so to speak. So we will be hearing some of both of those things, I think, a bit later. But I just wanted to finish by plugging the Maternal and Child Health Network, which has a focus on natural policy experiments. If you're interested in linked data, trying to make the most of the devolved policies across the UK countries, then do look us up. So it's led by Ruth Dundas at the University of Glasgow. So yeah, there's a website, or you can listen to our podcast. So just to finish by saying thank you.